So I was at this dinner party a few weeks back, right? Catching up with an old colleague. He just landed this big promotion. And honestly, for the first 20 minutes, he held court, laying out the whole victory. But he wasn't really talking about the job itself. It was all about the battle, the late nights, outlasting rivals, the political games, that whole killer instinct thing he said you need. He had this really intense energy, almost manic, like a general talking about a winning campaign. For him, the promotion wasn't just a title. It was proof that he'd won. Then his wife, she'd been listening really quietly the whole time. She made this little joke about how she and the kids basically never saw him anymore. The whole table chuckled, politely, but my colleague, he didn't. His smile just vanished. Poof, gone. And for just a split second, that triumphant general look disappeared. And instead, there was just this guy who looked, completely exhausted, almost panicked. He snapped back really quickly, changed the subject back to market strategy, competition, all that. But I couldn't shake that flicker I saw. That look. It was the look of someone who'd won the prize, absolutely, but maybe lost something way more valuable getting there. Like he was playing this game, right? Clear rules for winning. But nobody ever seemed to talk about the price of playing that game, what it actually cost. And that, right there, that moment, that's really what kicked off this deep dive for us. We're looking into that flicker of fear, that huge, often really tragic cost of the relentless societal pressure on men to always win. It's a pressure that's tangled up in these powerful global ideas like machismo, hypermasculinity, stuff we see everywhere. We've been digging into how this pressure gets built, how it's enforced in big companies, how global economics kind of weaponizes it, and ultimately how it turns into this devastating public health issue. For men, yes, but also for everyone around them.
Right. So our mission really is to unpack the rules of this winner's game. What does it actually look like day to day? How is it enforced? And it's not just about guys trying to fit in. It's about how big systems, global systems, make it happen. And maybe most importantly, we need to lay out the real measurable cost, the toll it takes. We're trying to show how these cultural ideals, these ideas about what it means to be a man, get turned into tools, even weapons, by the very systems from your office to global finance that shape our lives, often hurting the players themselves.
Okay, so when we start talking about masculinity, I think most people have this one image in their head, like it's a single thing.
Sure.
But you kicked off our research by saying, no, we have to talk about masculinity as plural. Why is that distinction so crucial right at the start?
Oh, it's absolutely fundamental because it forces us to see the variety. Masculinity isn't some fixed block of stone, right? It looks different, feels different depending on your culture, the time period you live in, your economic background, even just your personal situation. It changes. So using the plural, masculinities acknowledges a huge range of ways men express themselves and live their lives. And this is the key part, within that whole spectrum, there's usually one version that gets put on a pedestal. It holds the top spot in the social hierarchy, ideologically speaking. And that specific dominant ideal is what we call hegemonic masculinity.
Got it. So if masculinity is the whole landscape, hegemonic masculinity is like the highest peak, the benchmark everyone else gets measured against, the definition of a real man.
That's a great way to put it. It is precisely the dominant form. It's the set of practices and beliefs that provides the justification, the rationale for men's overall dominant position in many societies. And while we often link it directly to justifying why women might be in subordinate positions, it's actually more complicated. It also works to subordinate other men. Men who don't fit the mold may be seen as too soft, too emotional, or men who aren't heterosexual. It sets up a very strict pecking order, not just between men and women, but among men too.
Okay, so what are the main rules in this hegemonic playbook? What does the system demand from the so-called real man?
Well, the ideal itself is usually pretty narrow, quite hierarchical, and honestly often quite brutal. It tends to reflect the values of whatever group holds the most power historically, often white, heterosexual, middle-class men in many Western contexts, though it varies. And it demands a specific set of behaviors, often contradictory ones, things like, showing aggression, being physically tough, taking risks, but also, crucially, extreme emotional control. That stoicism thing, never showing weakness. And maybe above all, especially in capitalist societies, achievement, success, almost always defined by being the primary breadwinner, the one who earns the most.
What really struck me is this idea that the ideal is basically designed to be impossible to reach. It's like a game rigged, so you always feel like you're falling short, even if you just got that big promotion, like my colleague.
That is the absolute core of how it maintains its power. Exactly. Hegemonic masculinity isn't normal in the sense that most men actually live up to it. They don't. Only a very small fraction might even come close. It works more through creating these, Cultural symbols or fantasy figures, think John Wayne or Rambo or that ruthless CEO stereotype. These figures carry huge cultural weight. They represent this level of toughness, self-reliance, emotional armor that almost no real person can actually sustain day in, day out. The ideal is always shifting slightly too. You can never be quite tough enough or successful enough, or maybe the most insidious part, never unfeminine enough. By keeping the goalposts moving, the system guarantees this constant low-level anxiety and pressure on men to keep striving, keep proving themselves.
Okay, so that's the big abstract script hanging over everyone. How do young men actually internalize these rules? How does it get into their heads every day? This brings us to the man box, right?
Yes, the man box is a really useful way to visualize it. It's basically a set of rigid, interconnected beliefs and expectations. We see research showing that young men, maybe especially in that 18 to 30 range, feel this intense pressure to conform to these rules. What's fascinating and sad is that often they don't even personally agree with the rules, but they follow them anyway. Why? Because they're afraid. Afraid of being judged, being called out, being seen as less than a real man by their friends, by society. It's compliance driven by the fear of social punishment.
Let's break down the walls of this box then. What are these core rules that create this pressure cooker? Starting with the one that seems designed to isolate men. Self-sufficiency.
Yeah, this one might be the most directly damaging to mental well-being. It's the rule that says real men handle their problems alone, period. You figure things out yourself. You don't ask for help, especially with emotional stuff. The flip side is, if you do talk about your fears, your worries, your deeper struggles, you lose respect. That's the message. So this rule effectively cuts men off from vital support, from talking to a friend, talking to family, seeking professional help. It teaches them that vulnerability is basically betrayal of their own identity.
And that connects directly to the next rule, doesn't it? Acting tough, the need to seem invulnerable.
Absolutely. They feed into each other. Acting tough means you put on a strong face, even if you're scared, nervous, hurting inside. You project competence and control, always. This is how emotions get bottled up. All the messy, complex, negative feelings, sadness, fear, anxiety, they have nowhere to go. By demanding this constant performance of invulnerability, the man box creates this dangerous gap between how a man feels inside and how he acts outside. That's a straight path to psychological distress, anxiety, maybe even depression, and using unhealthy coping mechanisms.
Then we get into the rules about how men should interact with others, particularly around aggression and control.
Right. This set of rules says that violence, or the threat of it, is sometimes necessary. You might need to use it to get respect, maintain your status, or show dominance. And it very clearly lays out power dynamics in relationships. It says a man should have the final say in decisions, that he has a right to know where his female partner is at all times. This isn't about mutual respect or security, obviously. It's about establishing and maintaining control, sometimes through intimidation.
And the traditional gender roles are baked right in there too, very explicitly.
Oh, absolutely. This reinforces that classic division. Man as provider, woman as homemaker. The rule says men must be the breadwinners. And it goes further, sometimes stating explicitly that things like household chores, cooking, cleaning are simply not a man's job. Some versions even imply that teaching a boy those skills somehow makes him less masculine. It puts enormous financial pressure on men and, of course, drastically limits opportunities and autonomy for women.
And holding this whole structure together, acting like a kind of enforcer, is the pillar of homophobia.
Yes, this is critical. It functions as the ultimate gatekeeper for the man box. The core belief, often stated very bluntly, is that a gay man isn't a real man, or any man perceived as feminine. This rule acts as a constant threat. It stigmatizes anything that falls outside that very narrow definition of acceptable male behavior. And by doing that, it reinforces why you have to stick rigidly to all the other rules. Be tough, don't show emotion, be in control, don't do women's work. Fear of being labeled not a real man keeps the whole system policed.
Okay, so we've laid out this tight, oppressive box of rules. When researchers actually measure how strongly young men agree with these rules, what do they find? What are the real-world consequences?
The results are pretty stark and remarkably consistent across different cultures. Young men who score highest on agreement with these man box rules, they consistently report worse levels of mental health. We see significantly higher rates of depression, anxiety, suicidal thoughts, and overall stress.
And it doesn't just stay internal, right? There's a link to outward behavior too, risky behavior.
Absolutely. That need to constantly prove toughness and invulnerability, to take risks, it translates directly into behavior. These men are more likely to engage in binge drinking, drive aggressively, get into fights, and they report being in significantly more car accidents. But the harm doesn't stop with risks to their own safety.
This is where it spills out and affects others. The link between that internal pressure and causing harm in society.
Exactly. The data shows a clear correlation. Men who strongly endorse these toxic masculine beliefs are statistically much more likely to report committing acts of physical violence themselves. They're also more likely to be involved in online bullying and to perpetrate sexual harassment against women. So you see the terrible trade-off really clearly. Conforming to this dominant ideal, chasing that acceptance as a real man, it comes at a huge cost. It costs men their own emotional health, their ability to be vulnerable, and tragically, it costs the safety and well-being of the people around them, particularly women and other marginalized groups. The pressure to win this toxic identity game directly fuels behavior that harms everyone.
Okay, so the man box gives us the internal rulebook for identity. But where do the big systems, the external structures, come in? How do they institutionalize and enforce these rules?
Let's shift from the general script to a really specific high-pressure environment, the modern Japanese corporate world. We looked at that heartbreaking story of Kenji, the senior manager. His entire sense of self-worth was tied up in his corporate rank, his status, until he hit a wall and realized he felt like a ghost, sacrificing his family, his health, everything for a win that was actually destroying him from the inside out.
Kenji's story, sadly, isn't unique. It's representative of a really serious social issue in Japan. Karshi, literally death from overwork. And this isn't some new buzzword. It's been officially recognized by the government as a cause of death and disability for decades. They compensate hundreds of cases every year, people who suffer severe mental disorders or die by suicide directly because of work pressure.
And if you look at who is most affected by these work-induced mental health problems, the demographics tell a specific story about where the pressure hits hardest, don't they? They really do. It points to this intense pressure point in people's careers. While things like work-related heart attacks tend to peak later in life, these mental health disorders, severe depression, adjustment disorders, linked directly to work stress, they're most common among younger workers, specifically those in the 20 to 49 age group. The ones who are trying to build their careers, establish themselves, prove they can win within this incredibly demanding system. That's when the psychological pressure seems to be most acute.
And this level of dedication, this expectation of total sacrifice, it doesn't feel like it's just a company policy. It feels deeper. Like machismo, or a specific Japanese version of it, has been woven right into the fabric of corporate culture, often disguised as traditional values.
That's a really important point. The Japanese corporate environment often strategically uses, or maybe weaponizes, certain traditional values, particularly the concept of Ganbaru. Ganbaru is this ethic of persistence, perseverance, working hard, enduring hardship stoically. But in the corporate context, it gets twisted. The culture starts valuing input, how much effort you look like you're putting in, how many hours you clock, how dedicated you seem, often more than actual output or efficiency. Showing up early, staying late, looking exhausted, these become signals of loyalty and commitment, sometimes valued even more than your actual skills or results. If you fail, it's often framed not as a skills gap, but as a failure of Ganbaru, a lack of moral fiber.
So the company isn't just asking for your time and skills, it's demanding a kind of spiritual devotion, echoing maybe those old samurai codes of loyalty.
Precisely. That's why people talk about the samurai work culture. It expects total dedication, unquestioning obedience to superiors, and a willingness to sacrifice your personal life for the good of the company, the collective. This intense loyalty to the company often gets fused with ideas about national identity and personal worth. The man who gives his all, who sacrifices himself for the corporation, is seen as embodying a kind of modern Bushido. He's the ultimate real man in that context.
This connects to a really interesting, maybe complex idea. You brought up how power works even without someone giving direct orders. You mentioned Foucault's concept of biopolitical power, where control becomes internalized. Can you unpack that a bit? What does that actually look like on the ground in Kenji's office, maybe?
It's subtle, yeah, but incredibly powerful. Control isn't just about bosses yelling or threatening to fire you. It becomes something employees do to themselves and each other. Take the phenomenon of sukiai zangyo. That translates roughly as social overtime or keeping company overtime. It's the pressure to stay late, not because you have urgent work to finish, but simply because your boss is still there or your colleagues haven't left yet. So maybe Kenji finishes his tasks at 5 p.m., but his section chief is still hunched over his desk. Kenji feels he can't leave. Leaving would send the wrong signal. It creates this intense social awkwardness, this feeling of breaking ranks.
Okay, so if I'm getting this right, the company doesn't need a rule saying you must stay until 7 p.m. They just need the culture where leaving on time is seen by your peers as, what? Slacking off.
Yes, exactly. Leaving when your work is done, but others are still present, gets interpreted culturally as a lack of dedication, a failure of Gambaru. And that failure brings shame, hush. In a collectivist culture like Japan's, where group harmony, where reputation are paramount, shame is possibly the most powerful social punishment there is. The system relies on employees policing each other, maintaining the expected level of visible effort. You combine that man-box rule of acting tough and never complaining with the corporate pressure for Gambaru, and you get this relentless cycle of overwork driven by an internalized fear of social judgment and shame.
What seems really tragic, especially when you look at the details of these compensated karushi cases, is the massive gap between how the employee experiences the pressure and how their managers or colleagues see it. This awareness gap?
Yes, this gap is a huge problem. It's often why things escalate to severe mental breakdown or suicide. Workers will describe feeling completely crushed by impossible quotas, constantly shifting demands, relentless pressure. But then, when the mental health crisis happens, you often see supervisors or even colleagues dismissing it. They might say, oh, that quota was just a suggestion, there were no real penalties, essentially invalidating the worker's entire experience of pressure. Or worse, they attribute the breakdown to the worker's personality. They'll say, oh, he was just too earnest, or he took things too seriously, or he lacked basic communication skills. When these punishing, relentless work styles become the accepted norm, it becomes almost impossible for someone suffering under them to even articulate that the system is the problem, not them. They can't challenge it.
And this whole structure, built around the corporate samurai ideal, inevitably creates a huge gender imbalance, right? We see the stats. Men in Japan work incredibly long hours, much more than women, fitting that traditional main breadwinner role. But what's the ripple effect? What's the systemic cost for women's careers?
The cost is profound inequality and systemic exclusion. It's true that female labor force participation in Japan has gone up quite a bit recently, which sounds good on the surface. But when you look closer, that rigid, male-dominated hierarchy built on Gambaru and long hours makes it incredibly difficult for women to advance into real leadership positions or secure stable, well-paid careers. Most of the job growth for women has been in non-regular work, part-time, contract, low-paid, insecure jobs. In fact, something like 70% of Japan's non-regular workforce is female. So you end up with this polarization. A very small number of elite women in high-flying careers and the vast majority stuck in precarious work. The core system of secure, high-status jobs remains overwhelmingly male and resistant to change.
The government has tried, haven't they? There were those high-profile campaigns like Premium Friday, trying to get people to leave early, and laws capping overtime. Why haven't these policies really shifted the culture?
Largely because the roots of the problem are cultural and deeply ingrained, not just economic or legal. Take Premium Friday, encouraging people to leave early on the last Friday of the month. It mostly flopped. Why? Because the underlying cultural norms, the pressure to show Gambaru, the fear of shame, the need to conform to the group, didn't change. Leaving early, even with official blessings, still felt risky, like you weren't dedicated enough. Even the big womenomics push, while it did increase the number of women working, mainly did so by expanding that pool of low-paid, non-regular jobs. It allowed the government, often led by the conservative LDP, to claim progress on gender equality without fundamentally challenging the core Gambaru culture or the male breadwinner model that forces men into overwork and keeps women out of power. The script of glorifying sacrifice just overrides the policy attempts. So building on that, this intense cultural pressure we've been talking about, they need to be tough, self-reliant. The main provider, it isn't just some old-fashioned leftover that modern capitalism puts up with, is actually structurally vital. The global economic system, particularly in its neoliberal form, actively relies on and strategically exploits these ingrained ideas about masculinity.
Okay, that's the big connection then. How does the pressure of the machismo game become like the fuel for economic growth? You mentioned neoliberalism needing constant competition, endless expansion. How does it deliberately pull these gender ideas into its engine?
Well, the system essentially hijacks that traditional pressure. It takes the idea of being a provider, which historically had community and family aspects, and turbocharges it. It reframes it in purely individualistic, competitive terms. The real man isn't just providing, he's a relentless competitor, a risk taker, an entrepreneur of the self, constantly striving, constantly consuming to signal success. The male ego, already primed by the man box rules to seek status and avoid showing weakness, becomes this incredibly efficient and cheap engine for economic activity. The system basically sells men on the idea that their anxiety about status is necessary for winning.
That really came through in the story of Marco, the graphic designer caught in the gig economy. He completely internalized that hustle culture mantra.
Absolutely. Marco's whole sense of self-worth became tied to his earnings, his client list, his ability to project success in that precarious freelance world. He was surrounded by this noise about tech bros making millions, crypto success stories, and he started seeing everything, even his creative work, his relationships, as transactional, like a constant sales pitch for a version of success he hadn't actually achieved yet. The culture told him he had to hustle, grind 24/7, and if he wasn't making it, well, that was his fault. His lack of drive, his failure to sacrifice enough. This system demands constant self-optimization, self-exploitation. And for Marco, it led to burnout, intense anxiety, and feeling totally alone because he was always sacrificing connection, personal well-being for that elusive economic win.
So the system uses the ego like a carrot and stick. If a man doesn't succeed financially, if he's not seen as a winner in the market, he's failed not just economically, but failed as a man.
That's the brutal logic at the heart of what you could call the machismo economy. The underlying belief is stark. A man who fights, competes, and wins is valuable. A man who can't earn, who falls behind, is fundamentally worthless. This pressure to succeed professionally is intensely gendered. We see hegemonic masculinity directly linked to achieving status in the job market, controlling resources, and even defining which jobs are men's work versus women's work. This relentless chase for status makes men more willing to accept precarious conditions, lower pay, no benefits, long hours in the gig economy, just to maintain the appearance of being successful, self-sufficient providers.
And you mentioned earlier how this pursuit demands a kind of stripping away of humanity, sacrificing family and connection. If the man box teaches emotional isolation, the economic system seems to actively reward it.
It absolutely does. The neoliberal ideal is the hyper-individualized competitor. Connection, vulnerability, caregiving, these are seen as distractions, inefficiencies, things that hold you back from the grind. And guess what? Those are tasks traditionally pushed onto women. So when men are pushed or feel they have to choose between career advancement and family time, or between showing vulnerability and maintaining a strong image, the system rewards the choice that isolates them. They become estranged from support networks, from deep relationships. And we have to remember, this economic model needs losers. It's built on hierarchy. For every celebrated winner, there have to be thousands trapped in insecurity, their sense of male identity constantly threatened by their position in an economic game that's largely unwinnable for the majority.
The real insight here feels like the system isn't just passively benefiting from old traditions, it's actively engineering this pressure. It needs that male anxiety, that fear of worthlessness, to keep the whole engine of expansion and consumption running.
And that anxiety is incredibly profitable, isn't it? It fuels consumption. Men buy things to signal the success they feel pressured to achieve. And it keeps labor cheap and compliant, because the fear of being deemed a failure, of being worthless, often overrides demands for better pay or conditions. The global economic system fundamentally relies on men buying into the idea that their bank balance is the ultimate measure of their manhood.
Okay, we've followed this pressure from the cultural rules of the man box through the demands of the corporate world and into the engine room of global economics. Now we have to face the sharp end, the most extreme, the most tragic outcomes. What happens when this script of masculinity, this pressure to win, ultimately fails? When the despair turns inwards or explodes outwards as rage and violence, especially in cultures where machismo is particularly strong.
Right. And when we look at machismo, especially in contexts like Latin America or Spain, it's defined by a very potent mix of traits. Dominance, aggression, sexism, yes, but absolutely critically, reserved emotions. This emotional straitjacket is the key psychological point we need to focus on.
What does that look like day to day, that enforced stoicism, that clamping down on emotions? How does it affect a man's inner life?
It basically builds an emotional prison. Men are taught, systematically, from a young age, that expressing softer emotions, sadness, fear, vulnerability, grief, is unacceptable. It's a sign of weakness, of failing to be a man. They're really only given social permission for a very narrow range of feelings, maybe pride when they succeed or dominate, and anger for almost everything else, frustration, hurt, fear, disappointment.
Yeah.
It all gets channeled into anger because that's the one strong emotion allowed. This means many men literally lack the emotional vocabulary or the social permission to even recognize, let alone articulate, feelings like depression, chronic stress, or deep anxiety.
And the impact on mental health, particularly within the Latinx community, is huge because of the stigma attached, right?
Devastatingly so. This enforced emotional restriction is directly linked to higher reported levels of depression and stress among men in these communities. But here's the cruel twist. Because seeking help is seen as violating that core man box rule of self-sufficiency, of being tough, they are far less likely to reach out. Studies consistently show Latinx men are significantly more likely than other groups to say they would never seek therapy for depression. They see it as an admission of weakness, a failure of manhood.
Let's connect this now to that terrifying link between failing the winner script and actual violence. We look at the case of Javier, a man feeling powerless, invisible in society, who seemed to twist that despair into outward rage.
Javier's story is a powerful, tragic illustration of the whole destructive cycle. When he felt marginalized, unsuccessful by society's standards, maybe financially, maybe socially, the only script he had available told him that real manhood, real success meant control. Control over his circumstances, control over his status, and often, critically, control over women. So his perceived failure didn't lead to introspection or seeking support. It festered into this deep sense of wounded pride, resentment, a feeling of entitlement. I'm owed success, I'm owed respect.
Oh.
That internalized despair then morphs, twists outwards into rage, and that rage tragically manifests as violence, including, in the most extreme cases, violence against women, like femicide.
This isn't just about individual anger, then. It's systemic. It's how structural violence works, where women become the targets, the scapegoats for men's feelings of failure.
Exactly. The violence is structural because it emerges from these deeply ingrained male-dominant cultural values. It fuels an often unconscious misogyny, this underlying belief that women who are independent, who don't conform, who can't be controlled, somehow shouldn't exist, or at least challenge the man's rightful place. When men feel they're losing the power game, the script offers a fallback. Assert dominance elsewhere. And women, who might be perceived as challenging their authority or simply being available targets, become the outlet for that frustration, often with lethal consequences.
And the statistics on this kind of machismo-fueled violence, especially in Latin America, are just horrifying.
They are truly chilling. Machismo creates a cultural atmosphere where violence against women and also against LGBTQIA+ people is often minimized, excused, or goes unpunished. You mentioned Latin America tragically. The region accounts for 14 of the 25 countries with the highest rates of femicide in the world. We saw data from Mexico showing reported femicides jumping 135% in just 6 years, between 2015 and 2021. That scale points to a deeply embedded systemic cultural issue.
And it's not just violence against women, is it? It extends to anyone who disrupts the rigid gender order.
Absolutely. The need to rigidly police the boundaries of the man box leads to pervasive, often deadly prejudice against LGBTQIA+ individuals. Anyone who doesn't conform to that strict, hyper-masculine, heterosexual ideal is seen as a threat to the order. Statistics suggest that around 4 LGBTQIA+ people are murdered every single day in Latin America and the Caribbean, often, tragically, by people they know. The rejection and violence are direct consequences of machismo's narrow definition of acceptable identity.
And we should probably briefly mention Marianismo here, too, the sort of flip side of the coin that helps keep this whole rigid structure in place.
Yes. Marianismo is like the symbiotic counterpart to machismo. It defines the ideal woman, often influenced by traditional or religious views, as being passive, self-sacrificing, modest, virtuous, essentially, the perfect homemaker and mother. By defining women this way, it reinforces those strict traditional gender roles from the other side. Machismo dictates how men should be, Marianismo dictates how women should be, and together they lock the whole unequal hierarchy in place, limiting everyone's potential and expression.
So let's bring it back to the psychological impact on men. When their emotional range is restricted basically to anger and stoicism, what happens when they experience genuine sadness, grief, or the symptoms of depression?
They often literally can't name it. They haven't been given the tools or the permission. When those feelings surface, the low mood, the loss of interest, the hopelessness associated with depression, they get filtered through the only acceptable outlets. It usually means either anger, lashing out, irritability or avoidance, maybe through substance abuse, overwork, or just shutting down completely. They really struggle to identify sadness or despair as sadness or despair because their internal emotional dictionary has been censored by the hegemonic script. So the failure to win, the failure to live up to the impossible ideal, creates this profound, often unnamed internal despair. And that despair has to go somewhere. It manifests either inwardly as self-harm or suicide, or, as we saw with Javier, gets externalized as aggression, control, and violence, often misogynistic violence. The game dictates that failure must be expressed through destruction of self or others. So, pulling all these threads together, what we're seeing is that this constant pressure on men to perform hegemonic masculinity, be the tough guy, the dominant one, totally self-reliant, never show emotion. It's not just some quaint cultural habit. It's actually a very effective, very functional mechanism within our societies. And it's a mechanism that gets strategically used, exploited even, by corporations, by the engine of global capitalism. It drives that relentless need for growth, for competition, for consumption. It essentially recruits men as warriors of work who are encouraged, even required, to sacrifice their own well-being, their relationships, their emotional health, all for an economic system that primarily benefits a select few.
And I think the realization for you listening has to be that the prize everyone is chasing in this game, the status, the promotion my colleague got, the money, the power, it's kind of fool's gold, isn't it? The real wealth we lose when we buy into this game is our time, our physical and mental health, and maybe most importantly, genuine human connection, real vulnerability. The big shift, maybe the radical shift, is choosing to live differently. Choosing to live, to savor life, relationships, ourselves, rather than constantly striving to win this impossible rigged game. It's about consciously stepping away from that cultural narrative that tells us we have to trade our humanity for an ideal that's not only unattainable, but actually toxic.
And the final thought really has to be about the price, the cost of playing this game. Whether you measure it in the crisis of male mental health, the rigid corporate structures that burn people out and shut women out, or the horrifying levels of violence against women and marginalized groups, the cost isn't just paid by the men who eventually lose, it's paid by everyone, by their families, their communities, by society as a whole. And maybe, just maybe, most tragically of all, it's paid even by those who, like your colleague at the dinner party, look like they've actually won.